Welcome, everybody. I'm Jill Jonathan with Red, Wine, and Blue, hosting this exciting author series with Joe Carducci. And today we're talking to Jennifer Berkshire. If you're not familiar with Red, Wine, and Blue, we're a community of women who use digital media and friend-to-friend organizing to change the world one suburb at a time. As many people know, public education is a huge topic, especially in the suburbs at this time. So Jennifer is just such an advocate for education. She has a new book out called The Education Wars. And one of my favorite things, Jennifer, about your book is that you call it a citizen's guide and defense manual, which I like it. It's like, okay, you're not just telling us what's happening, you're giving us a guide and helping us through that. So welcome, Jennifer. Can you just start with, why did you pick that title and why do you view it as a guide to help people?
Well, I am so excited to be here. I just think the world of the kind of work that you're doing and that model where we're basically organizing each other, like that is really kind of the only hope we have, right? And I so agree with you that public education is really at the heart of that. And so when we were writing the book, we felt a real urgency. We looked around and, everything about, the ongoing fallout from the pandemic and then really radical proposals that are taking hold, particularly in red states. Public education is simply more vulnerable than it ever has been before. But we didn't want to write something that was just sort of like, more bad news, right? Like there is incredible organizing going on, including organizing that you all are involved in. And so we wanted to also point folks to success stories in hopes that they will then follow the lead of people who are having good luck organizing their friends and coworkers and fellow public education advocates and show them what that looks like.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for writing this book. I want to start with the bad news so that we can get to the good news. So the bad news, right, is that you had to write this book. We have to have these because the disagreements about public education. Am I freezing? Sorry, I apologize. My internet's a little sketchy.
Yeah, it's just a little slow. We can hear you.
Okay. So the arguments have changed. It's not quite the same as it used to be fundamentally, right? There's this sort of dismantlement argument of the entire system as it exists. So can we start there with the bad news?
Yeah, so let's start with the bad news. And so so one of the points we make is that in this country, we always fight over schools. When you read the little history parts, and I don't want to put people off because you hear history, you think boring, that is not it. You will think that you have been taken back in a time machine. How could this stuff all feel so familiar? And we're fighting about schools now because we're fighting about everything, right? And think about it. Public schools are really among the last institutions we have that bring together all kinds of people in the same space, regardless of your religious beliefs, your politics. That's just gotten a lot harder to do. But now, as you were just hinting at, like we hear more and more people saying, that model has failed. Either that our disagreements are so intense that it isn't even worth trying anymore, or that we'd all be better off if we just basically did it on our own. And think about, like there's so many people who are in the audience who are parents, and they know firsthand how hard the model of doing it on your own is as a parent. Like, what if that's how we viewed K-12, right? Like, to me, that just seems, not only do we know that that's a recipe guaranteed to widen inequality, but it just seems so lonely. And so I think we really wanted to try to wake people up to how dire the threat is, and then also give them some suggestions about how they can effectively push back.
And I use that a lot. Like, I feel like our work here is our jobs is to wake people up. I just kind of imagine shaking people. Like, do you understand what's happening? And I can say from my own personal school district in Ohio, A lot of us were woken up a couple of years ago when an extremist was voted on the school board. And then I witnessed firsthand a community coming together saying, this isn't right. That's not what I want for my kids. How can we stop this? So I love that you talk about success stories. And I'm just curious if you have one or two that you know, would like to share with what you saw.
Yeah, so I'd like to share one that isn't in the book because it just happened today. And that is that in Nebraska, there was an amazing effort to force a question about whether Nebraska is going to fund private religious schools with taxpayer dollars onto the ballot in November. And when I tell you that legislators, big donors, and policy elites there have gone to extraordinary measures to keep people from being able to vote on it, I am not exaggerating. These folks gathered enough signatures in 67 days. And I think what's so exciting about that is that you really see people coming together across all kinds of lines of difference. We're so divided right now along rural and urban lines, but this is one of those issues that brings together people from all different kinds of communities saying, hey, wait a second. And I think what happened in a state like Nebraska is that the coalition that has come together in support of wanting a vote is bigger than perhaps just the people who had strong opinions about school vouchers. People there did not like the idea that their elected officials were going to such lengths to keep them from having a say. And so that's a big success. Those voucher questions in Nebraska and Kentucky aren't getting the same level of attention as some of the abortion questions are, but keep an eye on that. And then the other examples that we saw so many of sound just like what you were describing, Jill, where a community wakes up and then because they perceive this threat, they're able to bring together a broad coalition that's actually much more expansive than the vision on offered from the extremists. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind, that when you give people the opportunity to articulate, like what kind of a future would you like to see? We all envision one that's really expansive. It's not just about pulling a book off of a library shelf.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's so much overwhelming support for public schools, like you said. And generally speaking, I see I'm frozen again.
We can hear you.
Well, we can hear you. You'll never be frozen in our eyes.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to let it go then. That was a pun. Sorry. Terrible pun. But there's a couple of problems with the idea, right, of the push from the other side is also to make sure that people don't really know what's at stake, what's going on. And they're using a lot of fear mongering to get people to go, oh, that sounds, I don't want pornography in schools. Okay, I'm going to align with you. And so once you start telling stories and telling the truth and putting, shining a light on what's really happening, and then you can get to that point where you have those victories, like you said. It's just whether there's this sort of juggernaut, right, where it's not the information isn't getting through right now. But that's why when we keep talking about it and we highlight books like yours, we can get those facts to the public school system and don't want to dismantle it. How we just get to them first, right?
Yeah, that's so true. And I think, a big part of the issue is that most of us have absolutely no idea what happens in that school. And so it makes us sitting ducks for these kind of campaigns, and you will see these again and again throughout history, right? So if it's the Red Scare, it's warnings about teachers indoctrinating your kids into communism. If we're looking at the 80s and 90s, when there's a big civil rights advance as far as gay and lesbians are concerned, that's where all the fear mongering is. And like social media has obviously poured gasoline on that. And the fact that we have so many schools, you can always find an example of something crazy that's happening. I get email alerts all day long from conservative groups warning me about the latest outrage. But I think that you pointed to something else that's really important here. As the work of schools has gotten more complex, it's gotten harder for those who do the work to explain it in a way that makes sense to people. And I think this is a big vulnerability for us. Think about all of the conspiracizing around something like social and emotional learning. If you're a parent, just the idea that your kid is going to learn to get along with other kids is like, that's a real selling point. I have a grandson, adorable. He needs a little help with this, right? But the fact that it's an acronym that no one can really explain, it allows people who have all sorts of ambitions and often a dismantling ambition to fill that space with the most dire warnings. Here is what they want to do to your kid. They want to turn little Jenny into a globalist.
And I like that you use the word dismantle, because I think that's what if we look like at a bigger picture, and you mentioned school vouchers, there is this effort to dismantle public education altogether. So can you talk a little bit about how school vouchers play a role in that? And then, also we can't talk about this without talking about Project 2025 as well.
That's right. And I would say that, for people who are new to this, you already know what this system looks like because you no doubt are familiar with higher education. You are paying off your own loans, or you're trying to figure out how to pay for your kids' college. Why is that? Because we don't treat higher education in this country as a public good. It's on you. You decide how much you're willing to invest. And then you're just supposed to make the right quote unquote choices, right? Like better major in something that pays well in the end. Well, really what's happening now is a push to make K-12 more like that. So right now we're talking about vouchers, which in all the states where they exist are basically picking up the tab for parents who already sent their kids to private schools. But as battles for resources get more intense, we're going to start to see the amount of the vouchers shrink, right? Like more and more of the burden of paying for schools is going to be on you. And I just don't think there's anyone out there who looks at the reality of what it's like to pay for college and thinks, wow, we should handle K-12 the same way. I don't think many of us we think about how much it costs to really educate a kid. Only the wealthy of us could really afford to pay for that on our own. And so we're actually looking at a country that would be shockingly more unequal. And buried beneath all of the jargon in the section of Project 2025 on education is that vision.
In the book about, like you said, you touched a little bit with the higher education model, that public education K-12 would be a commodity, viewed as something that some people benefit from, but not all. So then the psychology there is, well, if I'm not benefiting from this, I'm paying for it, and then obviously people will be left behind by that. And we all know exactly which kind of people will be left behind by that, and that's probably a little bit by design, or not a little bit, maybe a lot.
That's exactly true. So my co-author is an education historian. And this turns out to be so useful because I can ask him, Jack, did we ever see this happen before? And he always knows the answer. And because he's an academic, it will often take him a long time to give me the answer. But it's so interesting. So back in the 19th century, we had something in this country called a pauper school. And it was for the kids whose parents, couldn't afford to hire private tutors for them, because that's what you did back in the day. This is before we had public schools. And this kind of inequality actually is the reason why we have public schools now. We tried it. It didn't work. And so if you were poor, you would go to a pauper school, usually run by a church. And so you would have to sign on to the particular religion. And then, nobody wanted to be associated with this poor school. And so in the book, one of the arguments that we make is that our contemporary version of a pauper school will involve, like an online tablet, kids learning online. And then instead of a certified teacher, you'll have a guide who just passes a background check. And their job is to just, hover around you, making sure that you stay on task. So it is a very grim vision. Boy, I'm really bringing us down.
But I'm like, that's what you have to look at, the history. And like you were saying, like, okay, this isn't quite a brand new thing. It might be brand new to some of us where we're like, wait a second, like, and I'll admit, like, I feel like I was just like going along very smoothly. My kids were thriving in school. And then it was just like a wake up call a couple of years ago of what was going on at the school board level. So I think that is important to understand like where this is coming from and that it's not quite a new thing. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
Not a new thing, but also I think, so many people have had the experience just like you had, where something happens, they're woken up, but then they feel like they're the only community where this is happening. And so, what we would see again and again is that there was this amazing organizing, but people were constantly having to reinvent the wheel. And I'm sure you see exactly the same thing with Red, Wine, and Blue, right? That like that people feel like, oh, we're the only ones this is happening to. And that's by design. And so part of what we have to do is spread the knowledge that folks like you are earning along the way.
Let's talk about really quickly, if you can, who is behind this, right? Because I think that's important also to identify. And it doesn't seem to exist by itself. It's like part of, I always think about these things as sort of like cogs in a big machine, because you see this in the sort of convenience of the rollback on child labor laws. And our friend Jess Piper is often talking about their vision being like having the kids out in the fields listening to school on their headphones. And like, that's not hyperbolic, right? Like this is not necessarily something they haven't given thought to.
No, I mean, it's amazing. And so I love Jess, and Jess is somebody who really contributed to my thinking as I was working on the book. And she's a perfect example. Missouri has its own private billionaire, right? They have somebody who most of us have never heard of, and his top priorities are school privatization and getting rid of the state income tax. And you find today that this is true in state after state. We all know Betsy DeVos, right? Like she's driving a lot of this. But there are so many of these folks. And one of the arguments that we make in the book is that it's easy to look at the role being played by billionaires and conclude, well, they must be in it for the money, right? Like somebody like a Betsy DeVos or a Jeff Yass, who's the richest gentleman in Pennsylvania, they want to start chains of schools and cash in. But we argue that like what's really happening is that they look around the world and they view inequality as our natural state. And just as we saw back in the 1920s when we were in a fierce debate over whether child labor should be banned, you had a lot of people who thought, well, why should all kids go to school? Some of them are meant to work in the factories or the mines. I really feel like you hear that same kind of thinking popping up again, because it's impossible to understand, like, why would they be so in lockstep and spending so much money on a vision that we know is going to make us less equal? And I think it's because they think that the world is unequal, and it's actually the success of the public education project that they're opposed to.
I'm like, that's just, I mean, that's something to think about, right? For all of us to understand like where that's coming from. So, I think the first thing is knowledge. Knowledge is power. It's like understanding what's, the engine behind this whole thing. And then what can we do about it? So Jennifer, I know we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but what are some things that you talk about that people, once they start understanding what's happening, what can they actually do? What kind of actions can they take?
Well, first of all, you're so right that knowledge is power, but it's really important not to get so overwhelmed by what you learn that you start to feel like nothing matters. And so I can't tell you how many events I attend where somebody puts up the slide that's like the little cis power chart that shows like all the dots of how the people are connected. And I just watch all the energy go out of the room because people feel like, how can I compete with the resources that a Betsy DeVos has? And the answer to that is that they are afraid of us. It's why they went to such lengths to try to keep people in Nebraska, for example, from voting on whether they wanted their tax dollars to go to fund private religious schools that can discriminate. So there, like we have the people power, and it's really, really important to keep that in mind, to not let the knowledge make you feel like you're powerless. But then once you learn, once you wise up to what's going on, I think the single most important thing to do is to follow the red, wine, and blue model and really do that relational organizing where you just start talking to each other. And that includes talking to people with whom you might have disagreements. And so, I spoke this morning with an organizer friend of mine in Wisconsin who's in the book. Her name is Heather Dubois-Bournon. And she is absolutely emphatic that, like some of us, like when we encounter the angry mom at the school board meeting, our instinct is to flee, right? Mm-hmm. And Heather wants to get to the bottom of what's at the root of that anger. And she's convinced that, like if we actually just start talking, we'll realize that we're mad about some of the same things and that we might actually be able to do something about them.
I think that's incredible. I would personally like just attest to the fact that forever I only looked at like the big shiny objects at, the top of the ticket and the map. And I never looked in my own backyard. I didn't know. I've told Jill this many times. I didn't know that a town over, close to where I grew up, they were going through this extremist school board where they had all these book bans, and it was really it was very upsetting to the community. And what the community eventually did, talking about good news and good stories, is they reversed it. They flipped that board, but paying attention to these smaller school board issues and smaller races. And if people are feeling overwhelmed by that big dots, you can start small. You don't have to start big. Actually, you can have more of an impact when you do start small. Start at your own school board, start at your own library, those sort of things. I mean, I think, and then tell those stories. Like you said, that there's more that connects us than divides us. And these stories that we all share are really going to move the needle. And I think that organizing, as you said, that's I feel like the antidote to all of this.
I think that's such a great point. And, the other thing to really keep in mind is that our understanding of what schools do has just gotten narrower and narrower. So when I started writing about education in Massachusetts, it was in the height of the Obama education reform era. And there was just an obsession with test scores. And that was it. Like a good school raises test scores. Let's figure out how they do it. It had all been boiled down to that. And I think one of the other actual positive outcomes of these intense battles we're seeing in communities is that it's forcing us to really reckon with the role that schools play. And it turns out to be much, much bigger. And I view that as a really positive development, because part of what has made public education more vulnerable is this idea that it's just, like who's going to get really worked up if it's just about a place where you go to have your test scores raised, right?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about it. And I know educators have a lot of thoughts about test scores and how that's making their jobs a little bit harder. And so I want to talk a little, Joe and I have kids in school right now. We have school age kids. So of course we care about this. But for people who don't have kids or don't have kids in the education system or kids who have graduated from it, why do they need to be care about this? Why is public education important to maintain for everybody? I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So if there's anyone who's watching this who's in a rural community, I don't need to tell you how important the school is, right? And that in rural communities, people's attachment to the school, it lasts, well beyond whether they have kids who attend there. But I think a lot of us are waking up to the reality that a school is a key institution in the community where you live. And that, there was an amazing piece recently that in the New Yorker about a gang of affluent kids in Phoenix, in the Phoenix area. And one of the really interesting observations that the writer, fantastic journalist named Rachel Monroe, had was that school choice has actually weakened the fabric of this community, that there isn't the same, there's nothing holding it together. And in this particular case, they've seen sort of the worst outcome of this, right? This is a very affluent community. But we need to think about that, right? That once we started thinking about K-12 as a more individual consumer good, right? Like that it just matters. What I care about is the best outcome from my own individual child, but I'm really kind of incentivized not to think about anybody else's kids. That's not a recipe for a strong community.
And it perpetuates, the equity issues that you addressed earlier. And obviously that fits perfectly into Project 2025, because so much of Project 2025 is designed to sort of continue to, inflame, I would say, those divisions and those inequities. And so education is such a crucial component to that, because you're the foundation, but also of these children's lives moving forward, and the ability they'll have to earn money, the ability they'll have to get on a disadvantage.
That's such a key observation, because when people talk about Project 2025 as it applies to education, typically what you'll hear them say is that it eliminates the Department of Education. And that is important, but nobody really knows what that means. And where that's so concerning is for precisely the reasons that you were just talking about. The Department of Education enforces student civil rights, right? Like they are the reason why, if you have a child with special needs, that, and you have someplace to go if your child faces discrimination. And so they are proposing a brave new world with no civil rights protections. And in fact, the special education law known as IDEA would cease to exist. And so I think that is precisely what we need to think about, a kind of free-for-all that pits people against each other and leaves the most vulnerable behind.
And that's, as we wrap up, I think, all of us and people watching in the Red, Wine, and Blue community, we care about the vulnerable. Like, we care about community. We understand the importance of that social connection. And that's why it's so important for the work that you do, Jennifer, the work we do at Red, Wine, and Blue, and just getting the word out about what's going on and how we have to come together. We can't do, like one of my favorite things an organizer said one time at Red, Wine, and Blue was, if we all do a little, then none of us have to do it all. And I just hold on to that daily. And that's really a motivation of mine. So, just want to open it up, excuse me, to Joe and Jennifer, if you have anything else to end with. And then, of course, Jennifer, then we want to let people know about where they can get your book and all of that. But let me know if you have anything else to add before we close.
Well, Red, Wine, and Blue.
I was just going to extend my gratitude for your book as well. And then I will let you, sum it up.
So Red, Wine, and Blue is all over the book. So not only is Renee Seckel in its pages, and Katie Paris did a blurb for us, we've got some images from your sort of counter campaign to Moms for Liberty, which I just love. But I think that there are probably a lot of people in the Red, Wine, and Blue orbit who came to you out of concern over other issues, and now are waking up to the fact that public education is very vulnerable, and the efforts to dismantle it go hand in hand with the other things that drew them to Red, Wine, and Blue in the first place. So I would really encourage people, if they're not already thinking about themselves as organizers, to defend and protect public education. It's so important. I think it's one of the most key things you can be doing right now. And so I hope to be in that fight with you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I have the book here, which is just so great. I love the school bus right here. But just, Jennifer, where would you recommend that people find your book so they can get a copy?
So the book is for sale wherever you find books, and check your local bookstore first. Go to bookshop.org. If you are a devoted Amazon user, I'm not going to judge you. It's there as well.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. Also, I do want to mention that you have a great podcast as well that people can check out. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so the podcast is called Have You Heard? It's on every 2 weeks, and we delve into some education policy issue. It's funny. It keeps me sane. I absolutely love it. And so if you find yourself, if you're just trying to figure out what's going on in the world of education today, the podcast is an easily digestible way to do that.
Yeah, I love that. And just to let everybody know, check us out at redwine.blue. We can get you connected with people in your own community. We're not meant to do this life apart alone. We're meant to do it together. So Jennifer, thank you. Joe, so glad Joe had a flight early this morning. So I'm so happy she was able to join us. I mean, we're committed to this. It's going to take all of us, you know? So thank you for joining. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.